This is one of, if not the most memorable scene from Gravity, and whilst I didn't have a chance to catch it in theatres, it still blew me away at home. And even though they took the easy route of not going into space and instead shooting it in a studio, it's still really interesting to take a look at how Lubezki and the rest of his crew achieved it. So as well as that, in today's video, I'll be looking at the equipment Lubezki used, how he achieved the naturalistic lighting, as well as the overall look of Gravity. To look at the equipment, Lubezki used 3 cameras, an Arri Alexa M, Arri Alexa and the Arriflex 765, which was only used for one scene. The Arri Alexa was the first camera in the Alexa lineup, offering a super 35mm sensor and enough sensitivity to allow the camera to go 7 stops overexposed as well as 7 under. The Alexa M, however, was built to be broken down into 2 compact parts, which was perfect for lightweight work, but more importantly, 3D. The Arriflex 765 is a film camera, and whilst that may sound a bit odd to mix the two together, especially if it's just for one scene, it actually makes complete sense, and I'll get into that later. As for the camera though, it's a 65mm film camera, and as for the stock, he opted for Kodak's Vision 3 500T. As for the lenses, Lubezki went with the Zeiss's Master Primes, Panavision's Primos and Zeiss's 765s, with the 765s being used on the 765. The Master Primes, however, are extraordinary lenses. They are a set of spherical lenses that create an extremely sharp and clean look, with the ability to be opened up without losing much, if any, sharpness. Primos are similar with their high contrast look and near optical perfection. But in order to get the camera to move like this, Lubezki had to think outside the box. He couldn't use a Steadicam as we needed to move around Bullock and Clooney, going handheld or using sticks was out of the question, so he resorted to robots. And these robots were able to handle the camera, the lights, even the props, and all whilst allowing for the moves that would have never been possible with a traditional camera operator, although it did apparently go through the dummy in the rig the day before shooting, which really wouldn't have been pretty. It was very exciting to deal only with the quality of light, how harsh or soft it would be, the amount of bounce, and its colour. With a film set in space, there is only so much you can do regarding the lighting if you want to keep it realistic. Now, one of the major ways Lubezki was able to create such a natural atmosphere was through the use of a light box. Now, this isn't the sort of light box where you take photos of items to sell on Amazon or eBay. This is almost like a scaled down version of what they used on The Mandalorian. It was a 6 meter high box full of 4096 LED bulbs which would project videos of the Earth and space. The video would even spin, so instead of Sandra Bullock spinning in the detached scene, the video does. It's difficult to analyse the lighting of Gravity, as we saw in the quote from Lubezki, he would only deal with the harshness of the light, the amount of bounce and the colour. It's also extraordinarily natural, and I have little to compare it to as it's a film set in space. I will say that outside of the ISS the lighting seems to be quite broad, but without losing depth. The lighting gets much more interesting once we turn to night though. The only thing that's really illuminated are Ryan and Matt's faces, and it's with this really soft light. It's paired with a very warm and greenish tint, and it's really the first and only thing our eyes are drawn to in these scenes, that is when we don't see the Earth behind them. Once we find ourselves inside the ISS, the lighting becomes much more expressive of Lubezki and what we've seen in his work before. It's still natural and what I would expect the ISS to look like at night in some way, but we see that he plays around with the colour of the light as we go from a nice pristine white when she first enters, to a bit of a warmer hue before entering a green almost teal setting, and finally a sharp blue, and then we just stay in those 4 colours depending on the room and the atmosphere of the scene. And as always, to look at the meaning of the colour in the light, we have white, as when she first enters it's suddenly a neutral and more peaceful environment. As she moves into the fetal position, we see a warmer palette, which is usually correlated with a warm and safe environment, which for a second this is. Moving on to green, we get this feeling of potential danger, but with blue we have a sense of isolation. And we hit our peak with blue as she looks out of the window down on Earth, knowing she's one of the few people in space. To look at the lighting in general though, it was a very lengthy process. I mean, this is a film that took years to complete, with a lot of the time being spent mapping out the shots and planning the lighting. I think there were only about 200 cuts in the previs animation, whereas an average film has about 2,000 cuts. Lubezki also had a problem with the uncanny valley, which in simple terms is when something seems very close to real but you know deep down that it isn't. Now this is because the lighting in the previous animation is different to how you would want to light the actors, and then the composite doesn't match. So to overcome the uncanny valley, which would have taken us, the audience, out of the experience, was to use a naturalistic light on the face and then match the light between that and the surroundings as closely as possible, and that's how the LED box came to be. I never want to base my work on other films. I use them as reference for what I don't want, but what I did was a very intense search of images from NASA and the Russian Space Agency. The look of Gravity expands Lubezki's famous style into space. We don't lose the expensive wide shots that we know from his other films, the wide-angle close-ups are another staple that stays, and his fluid camera movement remains. I mean, it feels like Lubezki just let his camera float around, but with a sense of direction that comes from handheld. However, I did find this quote from Cologne quite interesting. Whenever he was tempted to do a camera move just because it was cool, Chivo would not allow that to happen. Which again just goes to show that just because you can move a camera doesn't mean you should, even if it's in space. But to get back on track, I want to look at how they created the zero gravity atmosphere. Now to my surprise, they didn't actually shoot this in space, so how did they make Bullock and Clooney float? Well, they used two main methods, the first being the use of water, where the actors would swim through their scenes. However, it seemed like the majority of the film was shot with the actors hooked up to a 12-wire suspension system, and then you pair those with a ton of CGI to either remove or add everything, and you get this magical experience. As for the scene where the 765 was used, it was in fact for the final scene. As the whole film was shot digitally, Lubezki wanted to create a feeling of enhanced mindfulness for the finale, and thought the best way he could do that was to go for a massive negative like 65mm. I was doing my work as a cinematographer on Gravity. In the process, I had to learn to use some new tools that are part of what cinematography is becoming. I found it very exciting. Now obviously a lot of this film was made with the use of CGI, but this isn't a CGI channel and I didn't feel comfortable talking about something I know very little about, so I'll leave a few links down below detailing the use of CGI in Gravity. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. You know what to do if you did. If you have a recommendation for an analysis, leave it down below. Thank you so much for watching and maybe I'll see you next time. Bye.